Welcome everyone to this second in our series of Future of Philanthropy webinars. These webinars follow on from a session we had in our Npc Ignites Conference back in October last year, where we were talking about the future of philanthropy and kind of key trends affecting philanthropy's ability to respond to the challenges that we're facing now and coming down the line. So not just COVID-19 and the cost of living crisis, but longer term challenges like climate change, migration and the refugee crisis, conflict, food insecurity and more. And philanthropy obviously has a huge role to play in tackling these global challenges, and so we're wanting to look at kind of how philanthropy might be changing and needs to change over the coming years to meet these challenges. So this session, as I said, is the second in our series. Some of you, I think, joined our session a few weeks back on philanthropy and systems change, and it's great to have you here again. And we've got another event planned in September, details to follow very shortly, which will be looking at sort of impact investing and other ways that assets can be leveraged for social good. So we'd love for you to join us for that as well. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Juliet Agnew, Head of Philanthropy Service at Barclays Private Bank, and by Doran, who's Action Inquiry Manager at Lankelly Chase Foundation. And for those who don't know me, I'm Sarah Denselow. I'm the Principal for Effective Philanthropy here at Npc. It is so hot today that I think we're going to try and wrap up a few minutes early so you can all go on sort of cool off before your next meeting. But over the next hour, 20 minutes or so, we're going to be exploring the topics of power, participation, and the next generation of philanthropists. Do ask questions as you go in the chat. Although I've just had a message to say that the chat is disabled, which I think we are working to fix in the background. So store up your questions, and as soon as we've got the chat working, then please go ahead and ask them. And we'll be noting them all down, and we have a bit of time for discussion a bit later on. Gillian, could you go on to the next slide, please? Thanks. So today's event is focused on several changes taking place in who is involved in philanthropic decision making and what that might mean for philanthropy's impact over the coming years. There are several trends which are changing who is involved in decision making on grants. So the first of those is the transition of wealth from the sort of post-war baby boomer generation to the next generation of philanthropists. I'm not going to say too much about this as Juliet is going to be talking more about this in the moment, but we're already seeing changes in the way that the next generation approaches its philanthropy and what that might mean for its impact. The second trend is the sort of increasing pushback against the traditional dynamics of power, which are, in many cases, sort of inherent in funder-grantee relationships, leading to initiatives which challenge these, from sort of the trust-based philanthropy movement in the US to the rise of more sort of inclusive and participatory grant-making approaches, which are seeking to kind of hand back decision-making power to people and communities. And then the third trend is around the sort of increasing focus in the sector on diversity, equity, and inclusion, accelerated by movements such as Black Lives Matter and Charities So White, prompting funders to think about how their approaches need to change to create more of a level playing field and considering which voices were previously missing from funding decisions. This is something that we're thinking a lot about at the moment at NPC, and we're going to be talking more about this in sort of coming months. We'll pick up on these themes later in the discussion, and I'm going to hand over shortly to Juliet and Joe, but I've just first wanted to say a little bit about how NPC thinks about power. Now, I've been with NPC for more than 5 years, working with philanthropists and other funders. And before that, I spent sort of a similar amount of time working with the Family Foundation. And so I'm kind of well aware of how intangible in some cases power can feel, and how easy it can be to be blind to your power as a funder, and how difficult it can be to strike the right balance. Next slide, please, Julian. A couple of years ago, we did a piece of work looking at sort of power in the sector. So we talked to funders and charities, and we looked at sort of where power is most destructive and how the sector can achieve a healthier balance of power and philanthropy. Our conversation suggested that power is not intrinsically bad, but there are many situations where it's unhealthy and damaging, sometimes extremely so. And we found a strong desire to sort of go beyond hand-wringing to actively address power dynamics, but many funders didn't really know where to start. Power imbalances can be very destructive. They can limit funders' ability to understand issues and make effective decisions. They can limit the ability of grantees and communities to thrive. They can undermine relationships, can limit the ability of all involved to influence social issues and achieve their goals. But this slide here kind of outlines a couple of different ways to think about what we mean by power. So on the left of the slide, funder power is often thought of in terms of sort of funders' power over grantees and communities, with responses to this imbalance often looking to shift decision-making power from funders to the people that they're looking to serve. But funder power is more complex than that. Funders also have power to take risks, to innovate, to work on sort of marginalized and underfunded causes, to take long-term perspectives, which stems from their independence and their range of assets. And meanwhile, working with others, funders can tap into sort of power with, the power that comes from building coalitions with others and supporting collective action. And then on the right, there's a kind of balance of sharing power, building power with others, and on occasion, where it might be appropriate, wielding power for impact. And some of the deepest frustrations that we hear from charities that we work with is that funders often don't own the power that they do have, and don't use it where they can do for good. For example, leveraging their investments or other assets in pursuit of mission, or using their influencing power to support the issues that grantees and communities are working on, and to further the work of their grantee partners. Next slide, please. So at the heart of funder power is often wealth and independence. So this slide is sort of outlining a few sources and types of funder power. So at the heart is often wealth and independence, but other factors are status, privilege, access, information, time, and ability to set norms, all of which will have an impact on interactions that funders have with those that they're working with, and with their work and ultimately their impact. Next slide, please. This next one, okay, you can click through, please. So our report made several recommendations for how funders can change their practice to rebalance power. So focusing on yourself as a funder. Firstly, this involves understanding your power and where it comes from, and thinking about the previous slide, which is outlining all of the different sort of sources and types of funder power, from wealth to independence to time to ability to set norms. Really acknowledging and owning those sources of power and understanding the impact that they might have on your work. Then diversifying decision makers means thinking about who has decision-making power in your organization, and ultimately shifting the power towards those closest to the issues that you're trying to address. And then addressing structures and cultures means thinking about how power is shared. Is power concentrated in a few hands, or are decisions more kind of consultative and collaborative? Is there room for debate and challenge in your work? Are you open? Are you transparent? And you're accountable to the people that you serve? And then sort of thinking about grantees and communities. You can click through here, please. This picks up on many of the hallmarks of sort of trust-based and flexible approaches, thinking about how you might redesign your approaches to facilitate impact. So rather than, for example, having an application process that encourages short-termism, collaboration, sort of at the sidelines, favored by competition, driving down costs, fitting to timescales that kind of work for the funder rather than for grantees or communities themselves. This looks at redesigning the approaches in a way that actually works for the organizations and for communities. And then also encouraging trust and openness in your relationships. This can be through unrestricted funding, through simplifying paperwork, through building long-term relationships and taking a relational approach. And then crucially, rebalancing power in your wider sphere of influence through supporting charities to put people with lived experience at the heart of what they do, because often there's also a power relationship there, and funders have a role to play in kind of helping organizations to have the capacity and time and space and resource to address that power imbalance. And then finally, focusing on your goals, sharing and building and wielding power in new ways to pursue your goals can help you to increase your impact on social issues that you care about. So funders can kind of consider how to leverage all of their assets from change, from their influence and convening power to their investments, their physical buildings, looking at opportunities to kind of build collective power and create spaces for change. Now, it's worth saying that whilst everyone, we think, has the role to play in rebalancing power, those with the most power have the biggest role to play. And of course, that means funders. So, trustees of funding organizations can transform how their organizations act on power, from diversifying decision makers to sort of taking, big, bold strategic decisions on how their work needs to change to be more sort of equal and equitable and inclusive, as well as influencing organizational culture. Grant making staff can kind of have an impact on the day-to-day, creating those sort of open and honest relationships with funded organizations, creating spaces to change, redesigning processes. And then to an extent, grantees and communities have a role to play in challenging and encouraging funders to do better, but really the onus is on those that hold the purse strings to drive the change. And then final slide, please. Julian. So since we published our guide in mid-2020, which kind of feels like ancient history now, the focus on power dynamics in the sector has continued, with external events like COVID-19 providing funders in the sector the opportunity to kind of reflect and have challenging conversations on power dynamics. And this slide just highlights a whole lot of different responses from those in the sector. These are, to an extent, on a spectrum, I suppose, from those which sort of seek to redefine the way philanthropy operates while largely retaining traditional structures, such as the trust-based philanthropy movement, which I mentioned, which argues for more sort of open, responsive, and relational approach to giving, kind of within structures as they exist at the moment, to those which seek more of a new model of philanthropy, such as the Baobab Foundation, which is looking to kind of redistribute power by creating a network of Black and ethnic minority community organizations, which will own the new endowed foundation that they're creating together. And then, I'm mindful of time, I'm not going to talk through all of these, but a few other examples. Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust is one of many organizations that, prompted by Black Lives Matter and others, are examining their role and responsibility in creating racial injustice as part of their history. And as part of this, Rowntree has found that its histories and legacy include some evidence of racial exploitation, such as activity in colonial economies in Africa and the Caribbean across the 19th and 20th century, with the Rowntree businesses benefiting from unfree and unfair labour systems, which cause serious harm to people of colour. The organisation is now sort of looking further into these aspects of their history and looking to make commitments to kind of further strengthen their contribution to racial justice and take a sort of reparative approach, thinking about grant making, investments, governance, and staff diversity, to try to focus on what they can do to address the harm that has been caused as part of their history. Cora Foundation is an example of a funder who has been trialing participatory grant making approaches in some grant funds that they've been running in response to coronavirus in Scotland. They've been working alongside communities with community-led themes, developing a new kind of community-led grant making program that's distributing funds in ways that are designed, decided, and led by communities that they're looking to serve. And they've been sharing lots of learning from this program, both on the website and in other forums. The Grant Givers Movement, many of you may well have seen, published a report on ethics in philanthropy earlier this year, which captured perceptions from I think 166 individuals working in the grant giving sector, predominantly in the UK, and sort of a range of different roles and seniority, looking at two overarching questions. Kind of firstly, the ethics of philanthropy itself, linked to the origins of wealth, kind of thinking about those conversations that the Rowntree Charitable Trust are having at the moment. And secondly, to explore sort of how ethics can play out in our grant making practice, and how grant makers need to shift their practice to be more equitable. Then the last strand of work that I wanted to call out is the strand of work that we're doing here at NPC, looking at sort of open philanthropy. And this is a program which many of you may have heard about if you've come to our previous events. We're piloting a new approach to philanthropy, which is sort of grounded in openness, thinking of this both in terms of sort of openness in an inward sense, bringing in voices, inclusivity, and also in an outward sense, thinking about transparency, sharing what we learn, being very open about our processes. So we've been assessing several different models of sort of inclusive participatory approaches over the last few months to find the right one for our fund, which we're going to be piloting in the financial hardship space over the next few months. We're sharing lots of information about that, and you can find more on our website and on NPC Labs if you'd like to stay up to date with that. I'm gonna pause here and I'm gonna hand over now to Juliet Agnew from Barclays Private Bank, who leads the philanthropy service, working with individuals and families, including those from the sort of so-called next generation. And she's going to share her thoughts now on the sort of transition to next gen, which is a different sense of how the voices involved in philanthropic decision making are changing. We're looking forward to hearing from her about how the approaches of the next generation might differ from those of their parents, what this might mean for their philanthropy and their impact. So Juliet, I'm gonna hand over to you now. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Really happy to be here talking to you about this really interesting topic. Just waiting for the slides to come up. If you could bring them up, Gillian. Great. Thank you. Yeah, just briefly by way of introduction, as Sarah mentioned, I am the head of philanthropy at the Barclays Private Bank. We have a really simple aim within the private bank philanthropy service, which is to educate and inspire our clients wherever they are on their philanthropy journeys. And in doing so, we really seek to encourage more and better philanthropy. If you could move on to the next slide, please, Gillian. Just by way of context, again, Barclays Private Bank is the section of the bank which looks after the wealthiest clients. So these are high net worth, ultra high net worth individuals and their family members. So in my work, I come across individuals who are on various stages of their philanthropy journey. So be they right at the start and what I call the kind of exploring stage. I spend a lot of my time talking to clients at the very early stages there. Also, a lot of clients who have been doing philanthropy for a while and are more at what I would say is the kind of evolving stage. So thinking about, am I doing this right? Could I be doing it better? And often at that point, their challenge is really around kind of exposure to new models and examples of how things could be done better. And we also do work with some clients who are really leading the space. So they're experienced, they probably have established foundations, they really know what they're doing. So it is a real cross-section. Mainly what I'm going to be talking about today is my experience of working with the next generation. Often these are children of our clients. In some cases, they have already inherited money or made their own money, but in many cases they haven't. And I think that in my experience of working with next generation at Barclays, they tend to be more at the beginning stages. So they're more, we're talking about individuals who are embarking on a philanthropy journey and often very much at the beginning. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I will just say that I joined Barclays last year. So I'm relatively new to the bank, but I have been 20 years in the sector, both on the ground in terms of working with the charity sector and leading charities. And then the second half of my career has been working with foundations and ultra net worth families, running foundations. So I have got a real kind of cross-sectoral understanding of philanthropy and social impact. And like many of you, it's been fascinating watching what's been going on in the last couple of years, 2-3 years, from a philanthropy social impact perspective. We've been going through seemingly unprecedented instability and change in the last few years, from a global pandemic to the Ukraine war, cost of living crisis, energy crisis, political polarization, George Floyd and racial injustice and equity movements. We've had Me Too, we've had Roe versus Wade, we've had a declining trust in institutions and traditional bastions of power, and of course we've had raging debates about climate change and this seemingly apocalyptic heat wave that we're going through now as well. And the reason I mention this is because, like many of you, I've certainly had my frustrations over the years working in the philanthropy sector and feeling that philanthropy feels notoriously insulated from change. And what's next has often looked very much like what's come before. But my sense is that the tides have been turning in the last few years, and philanthropy is now much more introspective, and there's the sense that this reckoning has been going on within philanthropy, which I think is very healthy. And it's something that the next generation are also grappling with. So it has been really exciting to see the new voices that are emerging in philanthropy and the new types of approaches that we're seeing from, as Sarah mentioned, more inclusivity in terms of decision making, participatory approaches, approaches which genuinely seek to share and distribute power. The next generation are obviously part of this new voice within philanthropy. So I'm going to focus on that today. And just by way of clarity, what we're talking about here is the generation X and some millennials who are poised to inherit 15 trillion or so US dollars between now and 2030. So staggering sums of money. And the three questions that I'm going to look at today are, who are they and how do they see the world? And I'm going to be drawing on a combination of evidence and my own experiences of working with the next generation. What impact is this having on philanthropy now and into the future? And how do we and why should we engage this group constructively? So moving on to the next slide, please, Gillian. So yes, I should be clear up front that we're talking about a distinct age group with the next gen, but this is quite broad. So it could be anything from early mid-20s individuals all the way up to early 40s. So it's a pretty broad group. And they're very similar to you or I, except for the fact that these are individuals who may be destined to take over the reins of a business. So they're coming from great privilege in many cases. They may be poised to take on significant responsibility, inherit significant wealth accumulated by previous generations. Some of them will be looking to take on or lead a family business. In other cases, they may be seeking to forge their own path with the legacy of wealth that their parents generated behind them. So this is the path that they're on. And we need to be aware that generational boundaries are largely arbitrary, but we are making broad generalizations here. But that said, there is research and I think anecdotal evidence that there are certain character traits based on the influences and experiences of this particular group of individuals over the past few decades. So I'm going to draw some of the themes out here. Unsurprisingly, perhaps to you, this group are very global. You know, they've grown up highly connected in a very connected digital world. So they have a great understanding of what's going on globally. And that may actually influence their giving to an extent as well. Tech savvy, digital natives, so they're very used to and accustomed to using tech, and they will expect to see it and consume with it and do a lot of their activities through tech. This is a group that is used to convenience and rapid information, so that has perhaps some implications on how they will engage with social causes. But they also want to feel connected. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that this next gen group like to work collaboratively, like to connect with their peers, like to work with their peers. And more than their parents' generation, I think purpose and meaning is really important to them. And that stands out across the research that we see. Money isn't enough for this generation. There does also have to be purpose and meaning to their lives. This is also a generation that's much more aware of activism and potentially engaged in activism. You know, social media has played a really big part in various activist movements over the past few years, and they will be accustomed to seeing that and possibly being part of that activism. Of course, you've got examples of young activists like Greta Thunberg and various indigenous leaders, for example, who are next gens, really leading the sphere when it comes to social activism. So I'd say they're much more comfortable with the concept of activism. And typically they're quite entrepreneurial and independence seeking. Again, we are making broad generalizations here, but this does seem to be a feature of this particular generation. They want to do things their own way. They want to set out on their own path. This is also potentially a group that is quite disillusioned, particularly the younger generations that have grown up with climate change and insecure wages and the various other social challenges that we have going on in the world. And connected to that, this is a generation group that is quite anxious about the environment. I don't know if any of you saw the Lancet report that came out in December 2021, so quite recently. It was absolutely fascinating, and it was looking at, it was the first large-scale investigation of climate anxiety in young people globally. It was the biggest ever study of its kind. And the results were really significant and troubling, to be honest. 59% of the respondents who was surveyed across the globe said that they were extremely worried about the future. 45% said it actually affected their daily functioning, and 75% felt that the future was really frightening. And these are really strong emotions across the globe, across continents. And that will obviously affect the outlook of the younger generations, particularly those in their 20s, I would say. But one thing that I think is perhaps quite heartening about this group, and which you probably will have heard about the next generation, is that they tend to think more holistically and in an integrated sense about how they consume, how they use their money, how they invest, and they want to be much more in alignment with their values across how they use money. But at the same time, there's also some evidence that there's a mismatch between that values-based desire and actually what they're doing in terms of their investments and their philanthropy. And I'll come on to that later, but I suspect that's actually more to do with needing practical support than anything else. But in summary, as I said, these are very broad generalizations, but given the scale of challenges that we've got going on globally and that philanthropy is trying to address, I think that the mindset of the next generation offers some potential hope for us. Next slide, please, Julian. So in terms of the implications for philanthropy, again, some of these things you probably will have seen or heard about or already seen some discussion about when it comes to the next gen. So the whole concept of giving whilst living is definitely something that is going to be more interesting and we're going to see more of with the next generation. There are lots of more high profile examples of people giving while living now. Mackenzie Scott, for example, being a very good high profile example of someone who has given a significant amount of money in a trust-based manner whilst living. So that's one theme for sure in terms of the implications. I also think that this generation understands root causes and systems when it comes to philanthropy a bit more. And I think, again, that's probably to do with them seeing in more integrated ways, understanding the connectedness of things, and also going through some, as a planet, we're going through some challenging systems-based problems such as energy crisis, food crisis, climate change, migration. These are all complex, interconnected systems challenges, and there's a lot of discussion about them. Use of tech has a couple of implications. The next generation will demand more transparency, I think, as a result of it. That may be challenging for some organizations. It may actually be a good thing to be seen, but certainly is an important factor. As I mentioned, engagement and activism, they want to be engaged in their philanthropy. So they're not a check writing generation particularly. They want to feel engaged, but they're also more willing to use their energy and time in an activist sense and support activism. Investment alignment, we've talked about, I think that's quite obvious. That's a good thing. Much more likely to think about aligning values across their investment portfolios as well as their philanthropy. Collaboration, very important. So working with their peers, sharing information with their peers. They enjoy that. They'll want to do more of that. They like to learn with their peers. I'm certainly seeing that just anecdotally with the next generation that I work with. And again, I think that this is a generation who have lived through broad scale discussions of the importance of addressing inequity and inequality. So I sense that this is a generation that understand these issues more inherently than previous generations. Even just thinking about where I work at Barclays now, it's mainstream to be thinking about diversity and the importance of diversity. And these discussions of racial equity and equity are being integrated into corporate life, even at the Barclays level. So I think this generation really understand these challenges in a way the previous didn't. And I'm definitely seeing some more radical edges with the next generation. I was speaking to a couple of next gen last week, for example, who seem very willing to confront legacies that may have been built on injustice and address those issues with their parents, which takes quite a lot of courage. And I'm also seeing examples of some really quite progressive action when it comes to thinking about wealth redistribution rather than just philanthropy in the old sense of the word. There's a particular philanthropist, her name you may have heard of her, is Christina Solberger, sorry, and she leads her family foundation, and she speaks very eloquently about her anxieties and concerns about family wealth and her desire to redistribute and educate her parents on the importance of the redistribution of wealth, which is really quite courageous. There's another really good example with Lily Lewis of the Processi initiative, where she actually has a section on her website which is all about accountability and talking about the approach that her foundation takes to challenge themselves around the responsibility for the harms they might have created around racism. I feel with this generation from my conversations that there is often a deep sense of responsibility when it comes to social justice. And again, we are making broad generalizations here, and I'm giving examples at the edges, but I do think those edges are really quite progressive. You may have also heard of the rise of new types of wealth advisors. So for example, there is a wealth advisor called the Good Ancestor movement, which again was set up by a lawyer who was concerned about the fact that the wealth management and legal industry seems to be in cahoots with wealth accumulation, essentially. And the structures that inherently get set up for wealthy families are just automatically about wealth accumulation. And she has turned the whole thing on its head and is trying to set up a movement where, and it's not for everyone, but where the wealthy can come to her to set up structures that are actually much more set up to redistribute wealth rather than accumulate. So again, I'm making a broad generalization here, but my sense from my conversations with the next gen and the research is that there is a kind of notional openness and awareness with this generation, more so than their parents, of the potential conflicts inherent in wealth generation and a desire to be more, inclusive, constructive, and address some of those conflicts in their philanthropy. Next slide, please, Julian. However, working with this generation throws up some common themes in terms of challenges for them, which I think are relevant to how we think about engaging them and relevant potentially to the challenges they'll face in implementing progressive philanthropy. A theme that comes up again and again in my conversations is that they struggle, next gen struggle with influence and communication with their parents. Trust and control issues really do loom large between the generations that made the wealth and the next generation who may inherit. And there can be sort of automatic assumptions that the next generation aren't going to be as effective as their parents in looking after the wealth, perhaps don't have a right to talk and a right to challenge because they haven't earned the money. So there's some really difficult, sometimes really emotive issues to be confronted between family members. And the next gen that I speak to don't always feel heard. They have got different views from their parents, and they don't always feel that they have confidence in the skills to really navigate that territory with their parents. The other side to this as well is it's important to acknowledge that there are common challenges to any new donor, whether you are 25 or 45 or 55, when you're starting out on your journey. And again, I see this time and again when I'm talking to relatively new donors, that there are age-old misconceptions about philanthropy and charity. So for example, at this Next Gen conference that I was helping to run at Barclays last week, these were children of clients in the room, and they were asking questions about how can you know that you can trust a charity? You know, how do you know that a charity is going to spend your money effectively? And to me, that's just classic misconceptions, sometimes media driven, about trust in charities. And just to mention, we did at Barclays do a report called Barriers to Giving in 2009, and we did another in 2019, which looked specifically at what are the barriers to donors giving. And unsurprisingly, the same themes came up in 2009 and 2019. The main barrier being a sense of a lack of faith in the running of charities, or a concern about charity inefficiency. So I make this point because there is a lot of work that needs to be done about simply educating new donors, whatever age they are, about the charity sector and the realities of the charity sector. And whilst this newer generation, the next gen, may be more open to more participatory approaches, more inclusive approaches, I really do think they would be open to them. I don't see much evidence of them being exposed to these examples early on in their journey. And I think that's just down to how we educate new donors. So, you know, when you're starting out on your philanthropy journey, you're unlikely to come across power sharing approaches unless someone specifically shows you those examples. So as a sector, there's some, in terms of the sector, the philanthropy advisory sector, we've got work to do to make sure that they are exposed to those examples and given some practical support to understand how to implement them. Next slide, please, Julian. So I hope it's clear why I think that we should engage this group in our discussions of philanthropy and in the future of philanthropy. I think it's very important that we recognize that all of philanthropy is about bridging divides, and this is just another potential divide that's worth the effort to bridge. But I do want to say, I know it can be tempting to label and dismiss the inheriting generation as the privileged few with no challenges of their own. But everyone has obstacles to overcome in life, and we all go through stages. So we have to acknowledge that this generation are grappling, yes, with great privilege, but it is also a different kind of burden. And in my conversations with them, if they haven't processed those emotions that they have around the wealth that their family have generated, there's some guilt, there's some shame. If they haven't processed those emotions and had support to work through them, those emotions can't be turned into positive action. So if we wish to bring them on the journey of more redistributive, inclusive, and effective philanthropy, we have a role to play in meeting them where they are, is my point, providing inspiration, honest education, and considering what communication tools to use to influence them and engage them. We also have to recognize that they're individuals. So again, I've said it a few times, we've made some generalizations here, but it's not particularly helpful to make very big assumptions when working with the next gen. We do need to kind of get to know the individuals, test and adjust approaches with them. Final slide, please, Julian. So in conclusion, if we want the next gen to be partners and positive change agents in the philanthropy sphere, I think there are three main pieces to that puzzle. One is the education about philanthropy, which is, again, whether you are a new donor, whether you are of an older generation or of a younger generation, this is necessary. They need education about power dynamics. They need to understand that power exists. They need to recognize it. They also need to understand different types of approaches, and they need to address some of the misconceptions. We need to support them to do that about philanthropy. They need practical support, and they need exposure to real experiences. You know, this generation, again, to varying degrees, may not have had a great deal of exposure to different experiences that beneficiaries, for example, might be going through, different communities. So some exposure, real exposure to the real world, it can be very helpful. And I think the peer learning and support piece is really important for this sector. In all of this, philanthropy is a journey. It's one thing I've learned from all the years of doing this kind of philanthropy advisory work, is that individuals go on a journey and you can only influence it so far. But if it's good philanthropy, they will go on a personal growth journey. And we can facilitate this through a combination of direct challenge and practical support. And we need to be brave enough to ask them the big questions, to support them to ask themselves the big questions. And I think that as a sector, we need to be very honest and willing to confront and lay bare the conflicts and critiques of philanthropy, as well as the potential, so that we can get a better understanding of strengths and weaknesses, and that we can all be our best versions of ourselves, and philanthropy can be the best version of itself as we move into the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Juliet. That was a really great overview, and so helpful to hear your first-hand reflections, given all of the work that you've been doing with Next Gen Philanthropists about the issues that are important to them, and how we might engage, sort of help them maximize the impact of their giving over the coming years. As you said, there are a lot of challenges for philanthropy to respond to. So this is a really important questions that we're thinking about today. So thank you ever so much. I'm going to hand over now to Jo Doran, who's Action Inquiry Manager at Lankelly Chase, and who's going to be talking about some of the sort of other trends in terms of new voices in philanthropy, particularly thinking about power, in the imbalance of power in philanthropic relationships, and kind of what alternatives there might be in our gift. So I'll hand over to you now, Jo. Thanks so much.
Cheers, Sarah. Cheers, Juliet. Morning, everyone. I'm Jo from Lankelly Chase. So a very brief bit about Lankelly Chase. We're an independent foundation. We're worth about £140 million at the moment, but that changes on a daily basis. We're 60 years old this year, but we've had a really big period of change for the last 10. Before that, we were based in a sort of a rambling old house in the countryside, and people would send in letters saying, "Can you please fix my church roof?" And somebody would pop a check in an envelope, and that would be that. So the last 10 years have been very, very different. So this is part of a tale about our tangles with power, and by extension, privilege, perception, participation. So roughly 10 years has passed since our shift from problems to causes. So I'm going to try and tell several converging and diverging non-linear stories at once, and I'm going to try and do it really quickly because I've got 10 minutes. So we're going to fast forward to about 2017. At Lankelly Chase, we're running programs. We have programs on changing policy and on what good support looks like, for example. So with good support, can you find those isolated pockets of good support for people that has done well, resource and support them, and then does that lead to systemic change? That was our starting assumption with that program. A little spoiler, we couldn't create systemic change like that because we created bubbles that burst on contact with other systems. But programs are default in foundation land, even though they may be called different things. Programs say, we have identified an issue, we'll disperse our resources on our terms to groups who are able to meet our criteria, perform the task in the way that we've set out to create the change we want to see, and we'll evaluate them based on metrics that we have set. It also assumes that foundations are somehow not entangled in the very systems they're trying to change. In fact, they're more than entangled, they're drivers of those systems. So the idea that they sit outside and unaffected is fundamentally untrue, and the cause of many of the ills of philanthropic practice, I think. So we couldn't continue to act in that way. It was tantamount to, at best, outsourcing change and responsibility, and at worst, chucking pennies into a wishing well and crossing your fingers. So we shifted to a different way of working. We started doing action inquiries. So parallel to this little shift was one amongst our trustees. So they began to ask some serious questions of themselves and their role. What is the point of us? What are we here for? So the pace of our work started picking up, and they realized they were too far removed from the action, as such, becoming sort of unmoored from what was going on, and they couldn't make good decisions. I'm doing the very wanky inverted commas good. What on earth is a good decision? Who knows? So at that point, they handed grant-making decision authority to the staff team. So that made us think about the charitable model and what it meant to sort of the world of change work. So we were armed now with a different way of working and a different mandate, and therefore we began to work with people a lot more. So the inquiry that I then worked on was handily for today called Power. The Power Inquiry. What a very grand label that is. And it was born out of a frustration that was felt by many of our partners that the hidden topic of power that dictated so much was completely off the table in most conversations. So we started to look into it. What are the dynamics? Where do they come from? What do they influence? What are our assumptions? And at the same time, it was important for us to try and understand what power meant for us as an independent foundation, how that manifested itself in both our work and relationships, what we needed to change to better embody the future we wanted to see. Alongside this, there are a few tracks. We began having some conversations that led to some shifts in our own thinking in the group. One of the first was that our endowment, the money, wasn't our money. It was the system's money currently in the wrong place, which feels totally obvious now, but governance protocols and conventions tells us that as stewards, we're responsible for this unearned, vulgar accumulation of wealth. How much does that convention, that implication, imbue undue gravity to foundations in systems? Stopping the view of the capital as our money was liberating, and I think it enabled the rest of the power work to flow a bit differently. So we came to realize something else that seems obvious now, is that power is a product of relationships. It's fluid. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. A foundation's power is derived from its capital. Power, like money, is essentially neutral, but has assumptions and appropriations projected upon it. So now the staff team were no longer in need of decisions being made elsewhere. 3 other things started happening. The pace of the work again, and therefore the spend, picked up even more. But crucially, the way we work changed and how we viewed money changed. The fact that our decision-making for grants had been devolved, even though it was part liberatory, in practice meant the staff team was ill at ease with it. It was incredibly uncomfortable to recognize that a small group of people would sit in a circle and discuss proposals and essentially give a thumbs up or a thumbs down like a Roman emperor. Uncomfortable is funder speak for deeply wrong. But since we had responsibility for the money now, we were forced to confront that money. It wasn't something that could be tapped into like a well. We had to ask ourselves, what was the capital supporting when it wasn't being turned into grants? It doesn't sit idly like water in a tap, it's active, it moves. In our case, some of our money was sitting with Barclays. So by extension, it was contributing to the bottom line of Europe's largest fossil fuel financier. The framing of the mission at the time was around the interlocking nature of severe and multiple disadvantage, which is funder speak for people who are having a really shit time and things out of their control kept making it worse. Extractive nihilistic capitalism as a way of life was surely compounding that. With one hand, we were trying to tackle those systems, and with the other, we were reaping the rewards of them. Funders often call that attention. To call it attention is to point it out, realize it's too difficult to solve, and then bury it. The good people and our friends at 10 Years Time say it much better than I can. They say philanthropy embodies the characteristics of capitalism that have created both our wealth and the interlocking crises. So we called it attention for a while, but it's not attention. It's a paradox. It's an unsquarable circle. Flipping back to the power inquiry. We spent a couple of years talking about power and running or taking part in resourcing mini change projects, which was different ways of getting into the subject with different people, how it manifested for them. We tried out lots of different methodologies with lots of different people. We ended up with 2 avenues to explore: participatory decision-making, specifically around grants, and governance. So to follow the participatory grant-making thread a little bit, we teamed up with some established players in the field, notably Edge Fund and Fund Action, to work out what it took to do participatory grant-making well. And it turns out it takes a lot. It takes genuine commitment, patience. It takes challenging your own identity. It takes time. It takes money. It takes being able to make mistakes and allowing others to do the same. And it takes showing up in a different way. Our devolution process, our closer access to and questions about money, our inquiry methodology, our power inquiry itself, our deepening existential questions all contributed to being able to show up differently. A lot about power in the institutional grant-making world is about how you show up. We'd for years been calling people we work with partners as a more sort of collaborative term for grantees, but we weren't in a partnership. When we made a grant, the terms and conditions were ours, our terms, our conditions. We did due diligence on people. If that's a partnership, it's incredibly one-sided, so that couldn't continue either. So we started on the participatory grant-making trail about 3 years ago. Now all of our place-based work either has devolved decision-making on the spend and budgeting in those places, or they have allocated participatory grant-making processes. All of our inquiry grants are done in circles where Lankelly staff are a member rather than the whole, and the proposals are done collaboratively. The devolution aspect is partly an extension of the board's conundrum, being too far away from the work. You're closer, you can make the decisions. And partly down to the earlier realization, it's not our money. Therefore, it's not in our gift to make unilateral decisions on where it goes, to whom, why, and how. So in terms of power shifts, this could be seen as one. Financial grant making moving away from the Lankelly board to the staff to wider actors. I personally believe it's a route into a power shift rather than a power shift itself. One of the other areas of exploration to come out of the power inquiry was around governance. Many of our partners had for years been telling us the ills of governance as it currently is. The way the sector views and does governance is outdated, restrictive, and elitist. This is both in attitude and in practice. For example, the main point of a charity trusteeship is financial. That means that a trustee's fiduciary responsibility is to make sure the charity basically still exists the next time they all meet. Is it living its values? Is it working well? Is it doing civic good? None of these are as important as money. This bleeds through to and is in part caused by funding. We cannot have mutual accountability, which is the cornerstone of a transfer of power, if money, where it comes from and how it's spent, sits at the top of the accountability tree. Accountability will always flow towards it. The charity mindset, and by extension, the charity industrial complex that maintains it, demands injustice. Without injustice, there would be no need for charity. The charity mindset demands a power imbalance. It determines that a party is in need and a charitable act can rescue that party. This helped shift our views on who we would work with because it changed what we were looking for. We found that we were drawn to justice rather than charity. One is about change, one is about maintenance. This meant that we had to change our own governance. The leadership team was disbanded and lots of new trustees arrived. So not only were we finding out what a power shift meant in how we relate to people outside the organization, but inside too. As with everything, we're still finding out what it actually means. Another aspect of the governance inquiry has been to work on the infrastructure of how we show up. And by that, I mean to go back to contracts and due diligence from earlier on. That's what we do differently now. Due diligence is mutual. We still have to ask questions for legal reasons, but we encourage questions back to us. It's really helped to get relationship off to a more even start. We don't ask for reports or evaluations. We're on a continual mutual learning journey. Our terms and conditions were co-created with partners to more evenly weight them. These form the basis of new ways of working where Lankelly staff members are active participants, not passive observers. They may not give us total skin in the game, but our sleeves are rolled up a little bit at least. One of the pieces of work in the governance inquiry is called Beyond the Rules, which are those hidden conventions that dictate mindsets and influence outcomes. It's a wide-ranging collaboration between multiple actors, and that includes a network of hundreds of groups and organizations around the world. We've been diving into the architecture of relationships, contracts, pay, grant making. These are the sort of neglected pieces of scaffolding on which relationships are built. In the same way that safe spaces can't be declared into being, power cannot be shifted just by an acknowledgement of unhealthy power dynamics. Active steps have to be taken. We often hear and talk about systemic impact. I believe you can't get a just outcome if you don't go through a just process. And as such, I don't think you can get a systemic outcome if you don't use a systemic process. Primarily from a philanthropic standpoint, I'm talking about grant making and contracting. We're still stuck in a world of binary point-to-point resource allocation rather than a shared many-to-many contracts that build accountability being shared amongst the actors that are doing the work and their shared mission. So all of this stuff for us has meant that we've had to confront the endowment, not just where it came from, but what it is actively supporting when it isn't making grants. It's meant creating the space for other people closer to the issues we're trying to tackle to play a more active role in determining how resources are deployed, not just in grant making, but in the stewardship of their work, what's important, what learning is and means, what's in and out of scope. It's meant challenging our own identity and the status quo. It's meant giving up on the idea that having money equals knowing how it should be spent. It's meant questioning our role, purpose, and how we organize ourselves, which in turn has meant relinquishing the security that working for an endowed foundation gives and leaving role and purpose and organizing on the table. It's meant all of these things and more, and that is just part of the first step. And I think that was under 10 minutes.
Brilliant, Joe. Thank you so much. Some great insights there. And I mean, so fascinating to hear about your journey and all of your learning. And I mean, I've written down some brilliant quotes. You know, uncomfortable is fun to speak for deeply wrong. Absolutely. And yeah, can't get a just outcome if you don't go through a just process, can't get a systemic outcome if you don't go through a systemic process. So much to think about there and reflect on, and some really nice overlaps actually with, you know, the conversations about the next gen and kind of the differences in the way that they're approaching their philanthropy and the sort of holistic approach, you know, thinking in a much more systemic way. We've got a little bit of time for questions, and I can see lots of questions coming in through the chat and through the Q&A function. One question that I think maybe targeted to Juliet in particular is about, you know, the young people, you know, the sort of next generation of philanthropists. Do we know what specific issues are most important to them? Juliet, have you got any comment you'd like to make on that?
Hi, yeah. So again, I'm making some big generalizations here because I think that there's obviously a lot of variety, but I think the younger generations are much more interested in the environment and the climate generally. That's just something that I'm seeing and hearing. But other than that, I think there is more of an interest in global issues. I think I mentioned that. They're very aware of what's going on globally. But beyond that, I think it really depends on how much exposure they've had to the social sector and the world of philanthropy. I think that rather like the broader donor universe, certain themes are very common in giving. So there's a lot of people are interested in education, a lot of people are interested in health. But the thing that maybe defines this group differently is the way they might approach it, I think. As well as thinking much more about the climate across everything that they do and the alignment of their investment approach as well.
Great, thank you. I'm interested to ask, so maybe this is a question for Joe. I mean, you mentioned a lot about, you know, the work of your trustees and kind of, you know, conversations that you had with your trustees, which sound as though it was a driver for change in the organization. And I'm wondering sort of, you know, what can people who are working in organizations do to kind of, you know, prompt those conversations with their trustees, because, you know, so often, you know, they hold the key to kind of the strategic oversight of the organization and you know, setting the culture. What do you think about that?
I think that's again one of the issues. You know, we're talking about sort of, you know, systems of you know, governance and decision making. If there's a sort of weird delineated hierarchy where there's this sort of group of people who meet 3 or 4 times a year that have complete strategic oversight of stuff that they couldn't possibly know about what's going on. I mean, I'm a trustee for an organization, and I know I don't have anywhere near as much oversight. Should I have oversight? I don't know. If there's a disconnect between the trustees, people doing the work, and then the people really doing the work, that needs to be bridged. And for us, we're quite lucky. We've got very small trustee teams, and I involve them as much as I possibly can in pieces of work that I'm doing, so that they get to see what's going on. Obviously, they've got restrictions on their time and all that sort of stuff. But I think just starting the questions has been really helpful for us. And that sort of the lines, the delineations become much more porous. And you know, we're all in it for the same reason, so there shouldn't be that delineation, in my opinion.
Absolutely, thank you, Juliet. I don't know if you've got anything else that you wanted to add on that. I mean, obviously you're working with individuals and families, so it's often slightly different structures, but I suppose it's, you know, those at the top who are kind of setting the culture. You know, how to spark those conversations with them.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I generally am working with people closely who are sort of earlier stage on their journey. But I do think that these questions and the challenges that we've been raising are relevant no matter where you are in the philanthropy ecosystem and how long you've been doing it. I think there are a lot of people who are just default. There's a whole legacy around, you know, how we do things in philanthropy. You know, Joe was talking about that a bit, you know, that there's a bit of a default and a historical legacy about how things have been done. And I think that we sort of sleepwalk into certain roles and ways of doing things without recognizing the harm potentially that we're doing. And I think that now the time is really ripe now. And I feel like whereas these things might have been seen as highly controversial to address with people in positions of power previously, I don't think they are in the same way now. I think it's a responsibility that we have within the philanthropy sector, but also quite frankly within the wealth industry. I work in the wealth industry, and I think, you know, I say this a lot, we have a responsibility to tackle some of these questions with people who are in positions of power, be they trustees or decision makers when it comes to donations of various forms. So yeah, I think it's the questions that you need to ask to challenge them, and the fact that you need to, I do think it's very important to provide practical examples of how to move into a different way of doing things, because that's, I think, has been a piece that's been missing. I think challenge without support and practical examples is not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I know that this is something that we talked about a bit, didn't we, when we were preparing for this event, the fact that, you know, for many, particularly for individuals and families, I think, who are often a bit more isolated, I think, than you know, the more established grant making foundations who are kind of part of the sector and, you know, parts of conversations with others and, you know, collaborative groups and coming along to forums like this. I think, you know, it can be much harder to see what are the examples of what you might be able to do. You know, there's a lot more kind of unknown unknowns, aren't there? And I think a risk that, you know, conversations about power can be quite scary and off-putting. So I completely agree. I think, you know, it's really helpful to have, you know, have those sort of tangible tips and tricks of examples of things that, you know, things that individuals and families can do to you know, to make small differences in the way that they're doing their giving. We've got a question here from one of the attendees who's asking about the role that we can play in sort of upskilling communities, especially thinking about children and families in participatory grant making. You know, what support do communities need to be able to get involved in sort of more participatory approaches? Maybe Joe, that's a question to direct to you initially.
Yeah, Grant, I think, yeah, there's a funny thing in this sort of power shift conversation. People always talk about creating space, and that's that there is something there. I think what foundations have the ability to do is clear space. That means paying people for their time to be able to actually actively engage in this sort of stuff. If you're just bringing people in for free to make a decision on a grant, you are fundamentally just absolving yourself of responsibility, which is not good. The karmic burden flows that way. It's not fair. I think one of the great privileges of working for a foundation is like it's a proximity privilege, is that you've got the time and the space to think deeply about the nuance of stuff. You know, just to pile into an area and say, here's a load of money, you've got to do participatory grant making, is fundamentally bad. Like, you know, it does take time to sort of say, what does this mean and look like, and how do you want to engage in it, and what does it take for you to be able to show up properly rather than, you know, rush it. Oh, my fillings just come out. Oh, great timing.
No one can.
Power shift from my teeth.
Oh no.
It's because you made me talk too quickly, Sarah.
Sorry. Send us a bill for the dental work. Great, thank you. That's really helpful, and, you know, sort of thinking about the fact that, you know, not done well, it can be harmful. Which I think, you know, is also a bit of a mindset shift for philanthropy, where, you know, it's sort of often traditionally been thought that, of course, if you're granting your funds, then you're doing good. That's not always the case at all. You know, important to think about preventing harm as well, both in what you're funding, but also in how you're going about it. I don't know, Juliet, did you want to? Oh yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Sorry, it was just another one. We were talking about risk earlier on, and I think that a foundation, especially an endowed foundation, fundamentally needs to change what it thinks a risk is. Its risk is not about money. Like, get rid of that idea of thinking that you're risking money. Fuck that, it's nonsense. What you're risking is harm to communities if you don't do it well. That's where we should be focusing our sort of risk analysis, if there is one, not about making money or spending money in the right way.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think thinking back to, you know, the slides that I shared at the start about the sort of different types of power, I think there are areas where, you know, funders have a responsibility. That, you know, they'll be quite independent. You know, they're not going to be beholden to sort of, you know, reporting to, you know, their own donors about how they're spending the money. And so by their very nature, they can take risks. And so, you know, there is a responsibility on them, arguably, to be doing so. And, you know, like you're saying, sort of thinking about taking a risk on a program that might not work out, because they can do that, whereas maybe an organization who's seeking funding from elsewhere, you know, they don't have that freedom. So yeah, I completely agree with you on that. Juliet, is there anything else that you wanted to feed in on that question?
Yeah, I suppose just I'm thinking about it again from the kind of donor, philanthropist, individual perspective. How do we empower communities to be able to do participatory grant making? As I said, I think it's in my world of working with individuals at a relatively early stage of their journey, they wouldn't even know what that meant. So there is a lot of education that needs to be done with donors about various different approaches and why they're important. And, again, working with donors to really think about their own mindset, quite frankly, about why they're doing this. And understanding the harm that they can do by trying to control decisions on behalf of communities. So I think there's a responsibility on the other side for us to make sure that donors have exposure to seeing what it can look like when communities do actually have control of their own resources and decision making. And to Joe's point as well, I think that, just making them aware that one of the most useful things that you can do for a community is providing funding which empowers in terms of skills, in terms of creating the space, the time to think, the time to grapple with these issues. Funders, especially in the early stages, there's still control issues a lot of the time that you have to unpick with individuals, and they can default into wanting to fund a project. But something like participatory grant making is the opposite of a project. So I'm often thinking about it from the other side, which is how can we kind of make sure that donors are thinking about how they can empower communities. And I think there's just a lot of work to be done to educate them.
Great. We had another question from Annabelle Broom from CAF, who's asking, when it comes to new voices in philanthropy and power balance, are there any thoughts about assisting families in addressing the power change between global north and south in philanthropy? Juliet, maybe this is one for you.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've been thinking a lot. So I think, one of the things that we do at Barclays is we have a platform through which we can educate and inspire our existing clients about what philanthropy looks like. And I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that we are centering different types of voices on our platform when we're talking about philanthropy. So not just looking at philanthropy which comes from the north, but also looking at and sort of providing a platform for philanthropy that comes from the south. So I think that that's one way that we can assist families to think about philanthropy and power, is to make sure that they recognize that there is some real innovation coming from the global south, actually. And just help them to see examples of that.
Great, thank you. Joe, do you want to weigh in on that at all? And I mean, I guess we could broaden this question out, so not just about families, but about other types of funders, thinking about the sort of power change between global north and south in philanthropy, and how those voices can be brought out, I suppose, and what role there is for organizations in this space.
Well, that's way out of my bailiwick, that one, I'm afraid. I couldn't even pretend to try and answer something like that.
No problem. Maybe then we will move on there's a question from Nicholas Silverleaf, who's asked about your social investment strategy. Where does that fit? Where does social investment fit within the strategy? For example, when is social investment more important than a grant, and are your processes different? Is that something that you're involved in with Lankelly?
Yeah, I think this is another thing about investing, that there should be some sort of return on that investment if you're making a social investment. When another model, so we're working on the grant making and contracting piece of work in Beyond the Rules with one of the partners is Dark Matter Labs, and something that they're talking about at the moment is a sort of a pay it forward investment, so that you don't get a return on that investment, but that investment is invested properly and then can be spread to another organization. So a 5-year, once it matures or whatever, an investment is basically a loan, isn't it? There's no two ways about it. It's just reaping that capital back to yourself with interest, when it could be just moved forward to somebody else who needs it. So there's a sort of a pay it forward model that should, I think, replace a social investment model. Because again, it's just replicating the same thing. It's demanding extra money back which is just bizarre.
Juliet, does this feature in your work at all, the philanthropy service?
We do talk about social investment a bit, and we talk a lot. We also talk about, you know, just aligning values generally and thinking about values when it comes to philanthropy and about investments, and just thinking that through. You know, and I do think that there are some just deeper questions that we address and that we need to address as philanthropy advisors and wealth advisors about how much is enough. Honestly, I mean, I think that is a question that I do think that some wealth advisors and philanthropy advisors have got the courage to ask, and it needs to be asked. And actually, often individuals and families appreciate being asked that, because it's some of the stuff that they're thinking about that they feel a bit weird about, but don't often have a space to talk about. And I don't think that it is good psychologically to just accumulate wealth. There is a lot of evidence that psychologically it's not actually good for anyone, yourself or obviously the wider community. So yeah, in terms of social investment specifically, we do talk a bit about it, but I would say that we talk much more just about centering values and really doing that deep inner work.
Great, thank you so much, Juliet. Now, I'm mindful of time, and I've said that we're going to wrap up a little bit early so everyone can go and cool off before next meetings and next engagements. We've just got a couple more questions. One is around the sort of the appetite from next gen and sort of traditional charities, and moving away from the sort of the idea of traditional charities, which makes me think of your point earlier, Juliet, about sort of movements and activism and you know, greater involvement from the next gen in movements. And I wonder whether you had any thoughts on sort of differences, you know, the differences in approach that you might need to take when engaging with movements as opposed to traditional charities. Whether this has come up in your conversations at all.
Yeah, I think that there still is a kind of, you know, going back to kind of common misconceptions. If you're new to philanthropy, there is an assumption that philanthropy is giving to charity. There just is. And that is part of what we're talking about here. It's not a helpful dialectic. It's not a helpful, it suggests giving, you know, it suggests that there's a need to be filled, which we as the donor are ripe to fill. And that's just not actually what this is about. Yeah, I think that there is a greater understanding now of different types of ways of giving and supporting activism and movements. I still think it's probably, that's still quite niche, to be honest. And I do think the next generation are going to be and are much more open to it. But again, like when it comes to education about philanthropy and what we expose people to, I think that there needs to be a concerted effort to challenge the language around just charity versus you are a philanthropist and that's the charity over there. Actually, it's a sector. We're connected as a sector, and this is about trying to bring about change. So it's about trying to actually display a range of options that you can use to help bring about positive change. It's not about giving to charity per se.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think, you know, work for sort of the advisors to be doing, to think about, you know, really what can that look like, and you know, how can philanthropists be sort of engaging in movements and you know, making that support as useful as they can. I'm going to draw to a close in a moment. I don't know whether you have any thoughts that you wanted to feed in on that, Joe, about sort of support for movements and kind of, you know, different types of initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, but the inquiry methodology has really helped us sort of broaden our horizons. You know, 5 years ago, we were mostly redistributing to registered charities. I think registered charities make up about 35% of our partners now, whether it's, you know, CICs or any other sort of unions and other sort of ways of organising that are a bit more aligned, I think, and giving to movements is a massive part of that, and working and supporting with movements, understanding the needs. You know, there's sort of very easy way of giving huge grants to huge organizations. Again, it's that sort of static, we keep doing what we've always done and we'll always get what we've always got, whereas it means working with different people in a different way, and the money needs to change direction to be able to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both. I'm gonna draw to a close now, but thank you so much, both of you, for your involvement, for all of the thoughts that you've shared, and for the time you've taken to join today. And thank you so much to all the participants for coming along and engaging in the discussion, and all of the great questions and comments. And I can still see lots going on in the chat. I mean, we'd love to continue the conversation, so do keep in touch. We're going to be sharing after the event some links and some of the slides from the session today, and do keep in touch with us, and we'd love to hear any further thoughts. I've got there's one more slide with a couple of upcoming events that I wanted to flag to you all. The first one is our next sort of Future of Philanthropy event, which is not on our website yet, but will be on the 20th of September, 11:30 till 12:30, which is tentatively termed the changing value of wealth. And that's building on some of our latter discussion there, thinking about impact investing and kind of other models of sort of leveraging assets for social good. And then also a flag for our Npc Ignites Conference for this year, which is going to be on the 11th, 12th and 13th of October, with 2 days online and 1 day in person. So we're going for a kind of hybrid format, and early bird tickets are now available. And we'll circulate a link afterwards. So we'd love to see many of you there, and continue this conversation. So for now, I'll say goodbye to everyone, and thank you so much again to our panelists and to all of you for being involved. And have a great day and stay cool. Take care. Bye.
Bye.